recording is in progress. I'm a journalist and I'm an author, and yeah, this is my debut book. It just came out a few months ago. It's called The Good Enough Job, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about it. I'm actually curious to hear about the other people that are here because we're, not the biggest group in the world. Elaine, would you mind if we just do a quick kind of a whip and hear from everyone else
Yeah,
that's here?
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, cool. I'll choose who's next, and then you can nominate the person after that. So, Faye, why don't you go next and just tell us a little bit about you and where you are?
Sure. My name is Faye. I'm located outside of Washington, D.C. I work in a do-gooder industry. I work for an international NGO. I used to be in consulting for the federal government, and the difference in narratives between those two sectors is really interesting. And I've just been amazed how problematic the narratives around nonprofit work are really just so problematic in society today. So I was thrilled actually when I saw this salon, and I've ordered your book, but I haven't read it yet.
Thanks so much. Do you want to nominate someone to introduce themselves next?
Sure. How about Katrina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katrina. I live in Los Angeles. I just left my role as of last week, Friday. And I did read your book, Simone, and along with other books, it really helped me kind of think about my relationship with work. So I'm very excited to be here and talking with you because I loved reading your book. And so I guess I worked in education for 10 years and I left, I was running a virtual school with an organization called Higher Ground for a couple years. And now I am a reader and I am an artist, I guess, a doodler and a tweeter. And I am a aspiring chef.
Awesome. Do you want to pick someone to go next?
Oh, yes. Let's go with Phil.
Hi, everyone. I'm Phil. Work-wise, I currently am a data analyst. I work remotely. Prior to that, I was in grad school doing research on kids' brains. Outside of that, the fun stuff, I like to write songs, play guitar, write a bit, run around, and just generally be outside. I'm interested in this topic because it shifting out of like academia, it was like my whole life, and now that I kind of have, I definitely don't work like 40 hours a week, even though I'm supposed to be, and I have all this kind of extra time and creative freedom to do a bunch of other stuff, and yet I still feel very compelled to uh, be productive and to produce things. Uh, yeah, I'm just generally interested in like people's relationship to work and exploring that. I'll choose Billy to go next.
Cool. Hey, I'm Billy. I live in San Francisco. I worked as a software engineer for about 7 years, and then I am now currently on sabbatical. I've been on sabbatical for like a month and a half now. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to take a break from all of that and sort of figure out other things that I want to do and like to do. So right now, just doing a lot of like playing the drums mostly and like a little bit of writing. Yeah, I'm just interested in the salon for like more perspectives on work and finding balance and like how people like to work. I'll nominate Melanie.
Thank you, Billy. So I'm Melanie. I'm from Paris, and this year I had a lot of changes related to work. So I was laid off in February, like thousands of people this year, and I was laid off. Plus, I realized I was in case of burnout, and I'm extremely lucky that in France we have an employment support for up to a year. So that gave me room to breathe and have a break. And I also, after 10 years working in marketing, I realized I didn't want to do that anymore. So I've done a training in product management. So I'm transitioning to product management, as well supported by the unemployment. And all of these different events this year really made me realize a lot of things about my relationship with work. I used to identify myself with my job title, my career, and spending a lot of hours working. And at the end, like, it didn't matter, you get laid off anyway. So this is why I'm very excited to join today, and I'm excited to read the book very soon. So thank you very much for having me. And I would like to nominate Naomi.
Hi everyone, I'm Naomi. I'm from London, UK. Yeah, I've done quite a few different jobs. I've sort of like seen, my 20s as a bit of a like experiment in figuring out what I want to do. But I guess I've always felt quite a strong sense of like values alignment with the work that I've done, whether that's been in politics or working for non-profit, or most recently I was working as a researcher for a technology company, mostly working around public transport and mobility in cities across the global south. So I got to ask lots of commuters and passengers around the world about how they get around and what's hard about that and what's good about that. But I was also recently laid off. The company is in the process of closing down in its current form, and so I'm haven't had a job for a little while, and so I guess I was looking forward to this salon as a way to explore work, the next phase of that, and what that looks like. I've just spent the past week looking after some 3 and 4 year olds, which has been another kind of work, and a good perspective on what it means to really lean into like imagination and play. So I'm feeling quite inspired about that. That's a bit about me. I'll pass on to Aaron.
Hi everyone. I'm Aaron. I live in Hoboken, New Jersey, and I'm particularly interested to hear about different techniques to analyze different roles that we all work in through our lives, to figure out what are the parts of it that are good enough versus what are the other parts that actually should be changed. And let me see, who has not gone?
I think just Ariel.
And Ariella, you're up.
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Ariel. I'm from Montreal, Canada, but I live in Reno, Nevada. I'm an executive coach. I work with CEOs, founders, and leaders, and I'm also a consultant with startups on go-to-market strategy. And I'd say in the last 2 years, I've kind of finally felt like I'm in a place where I can take my foot off the gas a little bit with work. And I've started oil painting. I've been learning the violin with no musical background at all over the last 2 years. And just really exploring like my identity and what makes a full and meaningful life outside of work, and who am I outside of just identifying with my work, which I feel like consumed most of my 20s. And so that's why this conversation stood out to me, and I'm excited to learn from all of you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing where you are in your life and your work right now. So I think to get started, I'm very curious, Simone, what prompted you to write this book and like dive into this topic?
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 ways in. There's sort of the professional answer, which is that I'm a journalist. I've been on the work beat for a number of years, writing for different magazines and publications about our relationship to work. But there's actually a more personal angle, which is that about 5 years ago, I guess now, I was working for this, trendy magazine in New York, and a recruiter reached out to me from this design consultancy called Idea that's based in the Bay Area. And I was very flattered, it's like I had never been reached out to by a recruiter before. And it's like, oh, well, always take the call. And I sort of passively went through this interview process of like, seeing if I wanted to pivot and go in a different direction. And then I found myself at this kind of career crossroads. And on one hand, it's like, woe is me, the agony of deciding between two attractive job offers. But I think on the other side, it was like, didn't feel like I was choosing between two jobs as much as it felt like I was choosing between two versions of me. Maybe some of you have been at a similar crossroads before and trying to navigate that. And it really sent me through kind of an existential loop. I didn't really know what to decide. And there was sort of one path with Simone, the journalist, and another path with Simone, the designer. And I started questioning sort of how did work come to be so central to my identity? And I knew I wasn't the only one. So the book kind of does two things. One is a investigation into how work has come to be so central to Americans, in particular, Americans' identities and sources of meaning in the world. And then the second is a bit of an editorial argument about the value of diversifying our identities beyond just what we do for work.
Yeah, that is a really interesting story. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to having like that decision where you're presented with two choices and yeah, and just it feeling like so much hinges on that decision, even though I don't know if that's actually true. Like I feel like maybe our paths are way more malleable than we think they are in the moment of being presented with like two different types of jobs. Yeah, I'd love to learn, I guess like maybe before, like if we should like establish like what we mean by work, because I think like it can mean so many different things in like different contexts. And like I think a lot about I think it was Elizabeth Gilbert, who had like that definition of there's like a hobby, there's your job, there's your career, and then your vocation, and they all have distinct definitions. But yeah, I guess like how do you, I guess for Simone or anyone on the call, like how do you think of work? Like how do you define work?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think Naomi's comment sort of got to a core piece of this, which is there's sort of the work and the labor that we're paid for that fits within the container of a job or employment. And then there's many other types of labor out there or effort, especially caregivers is a great way of thinking about, non-compensated labor. But, for the sake of the book and the sake of the argument, it's really about jobs. It's about sort of paid employment, whether it's contract or W-2 full-time jobs, and the centrality of work in our lives, the ways in which work has become sort of the central axis around which the rest of our life orbits. And, part of the argument is that there are other forms of work that we all partake in, whether it's work in the relationships that we're investing in or work to take care of causes or issues or people that we care about, the work to tend to ourselves. And I think one of the risks of a sort of job-centric existence is that it can crowd out some of these other parts of who we are. But I'm curious, maybe people like Katrina and Naomi who are in a very active, or Billy too, like active reconsideration of what work might mean in your life. I'm curious what you guys think. How would you define what work means to you right now?
I love when Elaine was starting off with just like there's hobby and career, vocation and work. I wish there's so many problems in language. I feel like that it's like this could be clarified if we just like could actively regularly use like a specific word to describe, because work encompasses so many things. And I feel like right now I'm thinking of it a lot in terms of just like what's my intended outcome. There's things that I want to do, learning to how to separate, like there could be seasons of my life where I'm doing something and it's for money. There was a line you put in your book. I think it was a quotation of something where it's like, whether it's work for money or work for fulfillment, neither is more noble. And I loved that. And I highlighted that because it was like, I think the issue is one, work encompasses so many things too. We don't have enough specificity in the types of words, and it's not part of common language of like what seasons we're going into and the purpose we're going into what we focus on. I think in general, the shared characteristic of all of these things is there's some degree of focus towards like it's the opposite of rest. When I think of like, I've had this new language in my vocabulary from Twitter, which is like a rest ethic. And I'm like, rest is like, I am not doing anything. There's no exertion, there's no energy, there's no output. So in that sense, even like exercise could be seen as a degree of work, but they all have some kind of different outcome. And I think I'm still defining what that means for me personally, like what are my different categories of work. But the more I see it that way, the clearer it becomes, and the more I see that how the hierarchy has become of me putting like a job as like the number one form of focus and effort, when in reality there's so many other valuable outputs of my time.
Yeah, and I guess like going to the definitions that Elizabeth Gilbert came up with, the reason I found it really helpful is I think there's this tendency to think that like basically, your job has to be fulfilling, and it's like the ultimate thing that is meant to fulfill you. But she makes the distinction between a job and a vocation, and a job and a hobby. And so like a job, in like you could define it, the way she defines it is something that you do to pay the bills, and your vocation is something that you would do regardless of whether you're making money or not. It's like the thing that compels you, that you just can't not do. And hobby, I think she defines it as something that you can sort of like dabble in. You're not necessarily like really great at, but it's something you're interested in. And and I love that because it's sort of, it kind of expands my understanding of like work, and like I could have both. I could have a job and I can have a vocation, instead of like thinking my job has to be my vocation.
Mm-hmm. I think something's interesting is like each of those categories and the expectations of how we should feel during and after, because sometimes there's this attitude of like, the whole like, if you do what you love, you should never work a day in your life, or your hobby should be fulfilling. But when I found the words rest ethic, I realized like there is a reality in which I'm telling myself to do more work, and it's not making me feel the way I think it should feel, because what I really need to do is actually just rest and like give my nervous system a break and feel calm. And I think seeing life in those categories has been a little bit helpful.
I'm curious, like there's this slogan that WeWork popularized, like do what you love. And I think I used to think, oh wow, that's great. Like what's not to love about that idea, right? If you can just like your job is like the thing you love. And I think it captures, I think, a certain ethos that I guess a lot of people like startup founders aspire to. I think reading, Simone, your book made me see it in a different light. It's sort of, in a sense, it's when you're like this idea of like the dream job, which I think that book, Finding Your Parachute, popularized. It seems like great, like who doesn't want to find their dream job, but viewed in a different light, it kind of becomes this thing that chains you, and like becomes all consuming. And I think you articulate it really well in your book, but yeah, how would you phrase like what is problematic, I guess, about like this like concept of the dream job?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong inherently with trying to align what you do for work with your interests or with your passions. But I do think the narrative and some of the rhetoric that we use around what is mandated or what is obligatory can definitely become problematic. For one, the ability to do what you love is not accessible to everyone. Some people have easier pathways or on-ramps to being able to align their passions with their careers. And I think, I did an interview yesterday for the Times, and the sort of pull quote that the journalist used was that, some people work to self-actualize, but the majority of people work to survive. And I think that's really important perspective to keep. And I think, part of the problem beyond just the accessibility of it is that when we tell everyone to follow their passion or to do what they love, and the opportunities to do so aren't evenly distributed, it can ultimately exacerbate some of the inequalities that exist. I'm thinking about people who might take on enormous amounts of student debt to pursue a degree that might not lead to stable job prospects on the other side, or a musician who wants to, quit their day job and go all in to pursue their art, but it ultimately is so hard because they're preoccupied with how they're going to pay their rent that they can't actually focus on the art that they hope to create. And so I think sometimes when we use phrases like do what you love, it can be in good nature. Who wouldn't want to do what they love? But in practice, it can set some unrealistic expectations. And there's this concept I talk about in the book called vocational awe. There's a way in which in certain lines of work, particularly creative or prestigious or do-gooder industries like Faye was mentioning, the rhetoric that you labor, that you work for love as opposed to a paycheck or some of the other necessities in our material world can obfuscate a lot of the exploitation that exists in these fields. When we say, you don't become a teacher for the money, or, as a healthcare worker, you have to always put the patients first. There's this idea that love can be a suitable stand-in for fair pay or workplace protections or job security. And in that way, it can be used as a way to sweep a lot of the injustice that exists in these industries under the rug. And so, I think with many issues in this book, it's not so black and white. I don't think there's like follow your passion or don't follow your passion, do what you love or do what you hate. But the tension here is, how do you pursue meaningful work without letting work take over your life? And I think part of the problem with painting in broad strokes and saying always do what you love, or do what you love and never work a day in your life, or the only way to do great work is to do what you love, is that it tries to give a one-size-fits-all solution to an issue that is very personal and unique to each individual.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do think like just because like your job is something that pays the bills doesn't mean it's sort of like on the other side of the like it doesn't mean like you shouldn't try to like enjoy it, or you shouldn't find something that you find enjoyable. I thought about it like it's great having a vocation, but at the same time, like because we need to pay the bills, like we do have to spend time at a job that ideally like we shouldn't hate, and so that's also important. So it's like, I guess, like going to the question of like, what is the good enough job? How do you even begin to define good enough? I know it's probably a very personal question, but.
Yeah, well, so for some of you who haven't read the book yet, I'll just tell a little bit of sort of the origin of the phrase, which is right up Naomi's alley. It's an allusion to this British pediatrician named Donald Winnicott, who was big in sort of the mid 20th century. And Winnicott was observing how there was this growing idolization of parenting, where all of these parents wanted to be perceived as the perfect parent and shield their kid from experiencing any sort of negative emotion or harm. And then when the kid inevitably felt frustrated or sad or angry, the parent took it extremely personally, like it was a reflection of their own shortcomings. And so Winnicott proposed this alternative that he called the good enough parent, or more specifically, the good enough mother. And the idea was an approach that valued sufficiency as opposed to perfection would benefit both the child and the parent. The child would learn how to self-soothe and take care of some of their own issues, and the parent wouldn't lose themselves in their children's emotions. And so obviously I'm making a kind of direct parallel to the working world and how our jobs, much like a crying toddler, aren't always things that we can control. And perhaps an approach that values sufficiency, thinking about what our job needs to give us in order to live the lives that we want to lead, is better than this pursuit of perfection, which can create unrealistic expectations. It can neglect other parts of who we are. It can set yourself up to be hung out to dry if the job is to go away for any sort of reason. And so, I what I like about the term or the framework is that it's subjective. You get to choose what good enough means to you. Perhaps for one person, it's a job that pays a certain wage. And perhaps for someone else, it's a job that has a certain job title or is in a certain industry or has a certain type of impact. And maybe for someone else, it's a job that gets off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon so they can pick up their kid from elementary school or go on that afternoon bike ride or have time to focus on learning the violin or writing a new song. And so the idea for me is, if we don't have our definition of what good enough means, if we don't define the relationship that we want work to have in our lives, it's all too easy to just inherit the definitions or the incentives around us, to let our employers decide, or to think that, more is always better, and to not really be able to set limits both on your time and the amount of energy that you're giving to your work. And so that's sort of what I mean by good enough. I think I resonated with what Katrina was saying about kind of seasonality, because I think there's not necessarily a right or wrong sort of way to figure out the pie chart of how much time we give to our job. Certainly some of these things are out of our control. Maybe there'll be seasons where we're prioritizing work and seasons where we're prioritizing our lives outside of work. But the sort of impetus or the push that I really want to urge readers or the world to think about is how we can think about our vision of a life well lived and the ways in which our jobs or our careers can support that vision, as opposed to the other way around, which I think is sort of the status quo of thinking about kind of the job at the center and then pushing everything else into the margins.
Can I share something? One thing that I appreciated so much about your book, Simone, was that every chapter was a different person's story. I have like tangential questions of like, what was the process of finding all these people? And I imagine there were like hundreds of other people you spoke to, and you had to distill it down to the specific interviews you've done. But I think a lot about narratives that exist in the world. And one thing that I've benefited from is being part of the internet and exposure to people's essays and people actively reflecting on the complexity of the relationship with work. And so that's, for me, taking a sabbatical, and I think perhaps similarly for the people in this call, taking a sabbatical feels like a very normal thing, and I feel very lucky to have experienced that. And I just love the way I'm thinking about like the accessibility of how do we get people to exist more in seasons or realize that a job is such a fluid, flexible thing. And I think your book like navigates that so well, because there's individual stories where someone can probably latch on. Like there were specific chapters that I was like, oh, that's like my entry point into how I could start thinking about balancing myself and my relationship with work. And it's really complex. It's really complex to deconstruct status quo, because it involves both exposure and curiosity in other people's lives and a deep reflection in your personal life to even approach, to even self-reflect on what is my own relationship with work. It's a whole journey. I just wanted to share that. I think that it helps so much to recognize the complexity of all the different stories that compose status quo and the ways we can deconstruct that through exposure.
Thanks for saying so. Yeah, I wanted to take a narrative approach for a few reasons. One is that's my favorite type of writing to do. I think I like reading stories. I am inherently skeptical of the sort of business self-help genre that's like, here are 5 steps to like, separate your self-worth from your work or what have you. And so I wanted to try and paint the complexity and the idiosyncrasies of people's career journeys and their lives. And I think it's something that we can really relate to, is the sort of twists and turns of different people's careers, and not thinking that there's this sort of static work-life balance, mythical land where once you like find Atlantis, you'll start to like float 5 feet above the ground in lotus pose or whatever. I think it's something that is an ongoing conversation that we're navigating over the course of our lives. And one of the benefits of being a journalist is I feel like I don't have it all figured out myself. And then this is on the page as well. It's like this is something that I am still wrestling with and struggling with it. And even the people who seemingly have it all figured out, or the people who you think might be the most sort of on paper successful, are often wrestling with a lot of these issues as well.
Yeah, I think this idea of like self-determination that you talk about in your book is like so important, just like understanding like what you value and what's important to you in your life. Because like we're so easily influenced by other people, by our friends and coworkers. Like even like if you see someone at work getting a promotion, it can feel like, oh, I'm not striving hard enough, or I deserve that, or like what. It's like, even if like you decide that there are other things going on in your life that require more of your time and energy. And I think one thing I was reminded of actually is what was it? I think Radical Candor, where the author of that book, Kim Scott, she talks about how like there's different phases in your life where you might need to like you might prioritize work, but then you might decide that work needs to take a back seat. And she has like this concept of like the superstar versus the rock star. I think that's what it was. And the superstar is like someone who's like really driven and wants a like steep career trajectory, and they're like taking on big projects and like growing really fast. And then the rock star is someone who's like really good at what they do, but they prefer stability, and they're not necessarily like getting promoted every year and a half or whatever it is. And she sees them as like modes, so you can like switch back and forth between them. It's not like a static identity. And like for like if there's a period of your life where you have other things going on, like personal projects or family to focus on, then like maybe you'd rather be in rock star mode instead of like that superstar mode. So and that's like perfectly okay. So yeah, I think that fluidity really made sense to me.
I'm curious about people who are maybe taking a more backseat approach to work right now, or deprioritizing work. People maybe like Billy or Naomi or Melanie, who have had to do a lot of, or even Ariel, who have had to do a lot of thinking about this recently. What are some things that are emerging for you all? Like, what are some things that you're learning about yourself, or what sort of work did for you in both positive and negative ways? Because I think our jobs are really valuable as well. They can be sources of community, they can be a source of purpose, they obviously pay a paycheck. And I think there's this natural inclination to either sort of villainize or lionize work and say it's like bad, work sucks, or it's like good, you should center your life around it. And I'm curious, for some of the folks that have had to navigate a more pathless path recently, what is coming up?
I'll share, because that spoke to me. I love what I do. I love my work. And I found in my 20s, I was just so focused on survival, like making enough money, being able to pay off debts, and while I enjoyed my work, I think there was also this, and I'm a millennial, so this might be generational, but there was this kind of thing that I believed where like your purpose and your contributions in the world are through your work. Like, to do meaningful work is how you contribute. And if you're not doing that, well, there's something wrong. The concept to me of, doing meaningful work through even like volunteering and this and that, well, I thought it was important. It wasn't like the the thing. And then, so I went along in this way. And then I got into my 30s and I noticed, even though I had gotten to a place where I still enjoyed my work, I was moving out of a place of scarcity and survival. I still felt like something was deeply lacking. I felt like I was just, I solely identified with like my work. If you asked me who else I was, I would struggle to respond. I didn't do anything. You know, I'd wake up, work, sit on my computer all day, go to bed. I wasn't doing anything to really explore my creativity or community, like family and friends. Even all these things kind of took like a back seat. And I just felt like something was deeply lacking. And kind of like what other folks have been saying about seasonal, life being seasonal or modes, I kind of got the sense that, okay, the season now, or the mode, is to take the foot off the gas a little bit from work and figure out, like, who am I outside of these things? And if I lost my work for whatever reason, right, who am I? So, and at least in the last 2 years, because that's kind of how long I've been on this journey, it's brought me a lot more groundedness and satisfaction. And it's also increased my confidence, because I've learned that I am more. I mean, obviously, I've always been more than my work, but I've kind of made that bone knowledge for myself. Like, I am more than just my work, and I can get joy and satisfaction and contribute outside of work, and that's been really powerful for me.
Does anyone else want to share like their stories and how you see work right now? And
Sure.
Yeah. Go for it, Melanie.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Phil.
I'll just go. This is reminding me of a conversation I had recently with my boss, and the context was we were discussing like my career growth, and as I was thinking about that a little bit after that conversation, and my priority right now is just not like climbing the career ladder. And I think I came into that conversation with that in mind, and it made the conversation really awkward, because then there was like nothing to talk about. And it made me realize that the default assumption is you should always be climbing the ladder. Otherwise, you know, like you're just not, I guess, progressing. And it was really difficult to like kind of understand why I was feeling so frustrated. But I think like it's just making me think maybe this is just the default thing, that like you can't just kind of like do your job and then like go do something else. Like you always kind of have to be like growing. And so I kind of struggle with that too, though. Like I know I'm not like focused right now on like the season of career growth, but like at the same time, my default like reaction to kind of like my dissatisfaction with like just lack of meaning in my job is to find another job that might be more meaningful, when maybe like I should find meaning elsewhere, like in community or, you know, other things. So I think I'm like, yeah, that's where I'm at like right now in terms of just thinking about like job stuff. Like I want to view my job more as a job and maybe less like a career. And yet there's this feeling though of like being left behind in a way. Like when I think about like future jobs and like, you know, what happens if, you know, I'm not like being positively reviewed in terms of my job. Like he doesn't care about, you know, growing within the company. So yeah, not sure how to navigate that.
Yeah, I think that's really, really relatable. And yeah, what you described, it's like it should be perfectly fine to just want a job that you do and you know you feel like you're good at, but not having to the expectation that you have to grow and move to like the next level. And that, you know, that should be that should be fine. Like if, you know, that's like what's right for you at the moment. And yeah, it's like, it is very relatable that so many companies, it's like expected that you have to constantly be moving upward. And so, yeah, it could be tough. Melanie, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I kind of relate a lot to Ariel and Phil's stories. Like Ariel, I identify myself with my work. I'm looking at my bookshelf, and I have a lot of books related to my job, or I was doing online trainings and going to meetups and focusing on my career like Phil a lot. And I've always thought I had to grow and grow and grow. And yeah, for me, who I was my job. And Katrina talked about sabbaticals. So when I got laid off, all my friends told me, oh, take a break, rest, it's been painful. And it took me a lot of time to accept to take that break. It wasn't natural for me to not be working or to be resting. And it's actually my body that reminds me that I need to rest. And now after a few months, I realized that there are other things in life than just work. I want to learn how to draw. I want to learn how to play the piano. I want to read books that are not related to work, except Simone's book, of course. I want to learn about biology or any other fields, you know, that I've always kept to later, like one day when I will have some time, but then you never make up that time. And since I don't have kids yet, I always thought that it was okay to keep working and working and working. And this all happened at the same time while in France, they passed a new law to push the retirement age. So before it was 62 and now it's 64. So that created a lot of conversation in our society and in the media. And I realized that, damn, I'm going to spend more 2 years of my life, 64, still working. So all the positive things arrived during that break, realizing that there are other things. And as Simone is describing in his book, I want to find a job where it will pay my bills. I will like it. I will enjoy it. But I want at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. just turn it off and do other things, which I didn't do before. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it was Ariel who said, or I can't remember, he said, kind of carrying this feeling of like there are lots of other things, but like your work is where you can make the most impact or something. And I think that's probably something that I also not only like subconsciously think, but also I probably consciously think that as well. And so that's probably been like some of the thread that I've been following through my different jobs. But I think I'm probably now in a space where I want to really like hone, having like explored my like curiosity in different spaces for a while. I am thinking that I want to really like hone my craft as a researcher and explore lots of interesting questions that help me become better at what I do. And so I think probably the next phase of work for me will look like I want to maybe it's less focused on like values alignment, but more about like, I think I do want quite a sharp growth trajectory, or yeah, maybe that's slightly the wrong framing, but like continuing to like hone my craft. And yeah, I'm also interested in, I kind of find myself often kind of moving between two poles of maybe being in a situation at work where it's a very like high growth, like lots to learn, lots of stretch environment, like working quite hard, and other times where I'm really like not so fussed about work at all. I can find myself like moving between those two poles. Yeah, and I do think the seeing these things through seasons is helpful. Like I hope that I'll have a job where I work crazy hours at something that I think really matters, but I'll also have seasons where I take a bunch of time off and focus on other things, or I'm just doing the bare minimum to pay the bills. Yeah, but I think the next thing will be about like, yeah, a bunch of like skills development, rather than necessarily feeling a huge amount of purpose in the questions that I'm exploring, even though that is probably still the longer term thing that I think I want to be moving towards. Yeah.
Something that I'm thinking about as I hear everyone share their relationships with work and non-work right now is I think to Esther Perel. She talks about how like sometimes we get stuck because we think pursuing love and pursuing attraction are like the same thing, but they're not. Like they're like walking on 2 feet, and it's like a stride of 1 foot over after another. And I think about, again, like the complexity of work. I mean, if you're just even in a relationship with one other person, that's already complicated in determining sort of what space you're in, or if you're in a space of like comfort and safety versus attraction and mystery. I mean, with work, there's so many different types of work. You can have there's so many different expectations with work. There's the complexity of coming in and out of work. I mean, there's a lot of privilege in being able to say like, I'd like to be in seasons in general, right? There's different lifestyles and different levels of income necessary to support those lifestyles. It's like I feel like my stage that I'm in is even just my work right now is establishing like what my expectations of work are, and like digging through the unconscious expectations that I have, or the conscious ones, or the patterns that I have. And like on its own, like that takes so much time and focus and expansion and reading, and maybe there's parts of it that are also just intuitive, but I feel like that's what I'm doing in this stage of my life, is just reevaluating and observing the relationship I have with work itself, and all of the expectations that I have, and all the ways that my expectations are incompatible, like personally. Because even in my own narrative and story, there's the whole layers of ways that I compete with myself, probably, in what I expect versus what I am willing to do at a certain time or whatever. Yeah, it's just, that's what comes to mind as I like think through what my own stage and also what people are sharing.
Billy, I'm curious about you. You've worked in a particular line of work for a number of years, and it seems like this is the first time you're taking the foot off the gas. What's it feel like?
Yeah, it's definitely been a lot to think about. So I think with my kind of like work history, I started at a job just like right after college, and actually like really enjoyed it. I was working a lot, but it never felt like, I think like, looking at it objectively, you could say that like work was my life, but to me, it always felt like, oh, I'm someone who just like really enjoys my job. And like, that's kind of what I'm doing. But I think over time, like my priorities changed a little bit, like the job kind of changed a little bit. But it was sort of like the demand of the job was still there, that it was like fairly like all consuming. But then it's like I started enjoying it less because of like the job duties, and then also the things I wanted expanded outside of what the job was like providing. And so I think over time I just like started getting more and more dissatisfied, and like the job was, I guess, like meeting less and less of my needs. And so that's kind of like ultimately where I got to the point where I like, went on sabbatical, was like, okay, I have a lot of like, I guess, complicated desires and values and things that I want like out of my life. And I kind of need to get away from this sort of like all consuming job. Or it's also like I have some tendency to like be consumed by work in some sense. And so yeah, what I'm sort of looking for now is some other type of way to go, sort of like along like the pathless path type of thing of like, is there a way that I can live that where I can kind of meet more of my needs that I have that are like more broad. And that to me right now doesn't seem like it's very compatible with like, a traditional like corporate job. And so that's, yeah, sort of kind of like where I'm at now on that path.
I want to talk a little bit about this idea of like segmenting your work from your like the rest of your life, and then like or like integrating it. I know Melanie, I think you mentioned like it would be great if you could just like shut work off at 5 p.m. and not think about it. I like I'm curious like how people feel. Like, are you more in the segmenter camp, or are you more in like the integrator camp? I know like when I was first starting off in my career, I think I was definitely more in the integrator camp, and it was probably influenced by a lot of these I guess like the prestige of like working at a startup and all the office perks. And like I know there's this job site, the Muse, that was very popular back then, and they curated these like really sleek photos of like startup offices, and it like I think they might have even coined the term like work-life blend. And so that was something that I was like so bought into at that time. And then like I think slowly as I've progressed in my career, I've started to value segmenting work from life more and more. Yeah, and so I'm curious how everyone else thinks about that.
The first thing that kind of came to my mind was like, it seems easier to do this kind of segmentation within certain jobs. I remember at one point I wanted to work as a therapist because I was like looking for this like singular, all-consuming source of meaning. But I kind of realized that actually like the way that I like to operate day to day is very like I like to segment things. And so I'm in that situation now where I can like code something up and like solve this particular well-defined problem within my job, and then just turn it off because I know I've like solved this thing. And even if I haven't, it's a lot easier to stop because it doesn't feel like anybody's like life or anything like that is at stake. So I'm like thankful that I realized that early, because I think if I was put myself in a situation where there was a lot of not so much separation, I think maybe it would be more difficult to like pursue other things outside of work that are also meaningful for me.
Yeah, there's a great irony in my process of writing this book, because I did the majority of it on the side of a full-time job. And, then towards the end, I quit the job, and I've been working for myself for about a year. And I thought that it was my boss or the culture of the companies in which I worked that were pushing me to work all the time, or to open my email at dinner, or the laptop on the weekends. And then I started working for myself, and I realized that I was the problem. Like, I was the worst manager that I had ever had, and I'd feel good on weeks that I hit my writing goals, and like I was a lesser person on weeks that I didn't. And on days that I didn't feel very productive, I would, push myself to work longer, which obviously didn't increase my productivity at all. And I'm in this like vicious doom loop of working long and not resting, which is driving me to not be productive and work longer. And I think it's tough. I think what we were talking about earlier about the sort of feeling that if you aren't somehow getting ahead, you're falling behind. But I think that like needing to prioritize life outside of work and find hobbies can be its own form of pressure. You look around and it feels like everyone is like a crochet ukulele baker, and what about my passions? How do I cultivate them? And so I think, with a lot of these conversations about integrators versus segmenters, or work-life balance versus work-life integration versus work-life blend versus work-life harmony, they're all sort of just like semantic distinctions, like they're just like ways of trying to make sense of our own days. And I think one of the things that I kind of came through writing the book was the idea of work-life balance can be about time and like what you allocate your time towards. And certainly to cultivate other identities or hobbies, you need to dedicate time to them. But I think it's also about identity. It's also about diversifying our kind of self-conception of thinking of ourselves as more than and just workers. Certainly we are all more than just workers. We are friends and neighbors and partners and siblings and citizens, etc. But the unlock for me was understanding that these identities that exist within us grow in proportion to how much time and attention we give to them. These identities can sort of rest dormant until we square our hips towards them. I'm thinking like I'm Jewish. That's my like religious upbringing, and the majority of the year I don't feel very Jewish. But then occasionally there's like holidays that I celebrate with friends and family, and then I feel more Jewish. And it's not just like random. It's because I've chosen to invest in them. And so I don't think that there is like a right way to be, between the people that want to like work from 9 to 5 and leave the laptop at work and then go home and do the rest of their life, versus the people that might want to go grocery shopping or go for a run at 2 p.m. and then sign back online and do some deep work at 7 p.m. after dinner. I don't think there is like any prescriptive one size fits all identities. And I think one thing that I've learned through doing a lot of talking about the book recently is that caring less about your job is not actionable advice. You can't just be like, care about work less. But I think the alternative is, how might we invest in other sides of ourselves more? And so thinking about what are the other things in your life that you value. Maybe it is your friendships, or maybe it is, your creative expression, or maybe it is your ability to get to know your local community or to exercise, what have you. But I think there's a line in the book that's sort of like, on the other side of prioritizing work is prioritizing life. And by that, I don't mean that we should necessarily like shove work into a corner. I actually think that all of these sort of anti-work memes are not actually, they're like kind of red herrings. You can be like anti-capitalist or anti-work, but we still live in a material world and you still have to pay rent. And I think a lot of us can relate to the idea that the days that feel hardest at the office are days in which you don't feel engaged by your work, where you feel like you're just kind of going through the motions and phoning it in. And so that's ultimately what I think about when I think about, a balanced life, is how are you thinking about all of the things that you care about, all of your different values, and actually like voting with your time and your energy. How are you investing in them in the same way that like an investor might invest in a more diverse stock portfolio?
There's this like therapeutic method called internal family systems that I'm very interested in currently. And a friend of mine approaches it in a way where she like deeply imagines different identities of herself and names them different things. And when I think about what you said, I think the best way for me to like integrate that in my life is to imagine there's like 10 different Katrinas. There's like artist Katrina, and there's chef Katrina, and then there's like bedtime Katrina and Netflix Katrina. And like giving them whole lives and being like, okay, like artist Katrina, it's your time to like shine and take the wheel. It somehow for me personally makes it feel very possible to imagine having so many different types of identities and pursuits in me. And I think there's part of me that I don't know, the imaginative process of for it like really helps me to imagine like actually corporate Katrina like taking a back seat, because the more I think I'm so locked into certain habits of mind that I don't realize there's this whole other version of existing that probably intuitively already exists in me if I just I asked gently up for a part of me to like take a little bit of a break and knew that someone else could take the wheel and we'll be okay. Like maybe artist Katrina knows actually how to bring some funds, and it might not be, you know, like a lot, but we'll be okay. And so trusting different parts of me to meet different needs in different ways, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I love that connection to internal family systems. It makes a lot of sense because there's like, yeah, we probably have that like inner like taskmaster or like the whatever it is in us that's like very, very driven. But then there are other sides of our personality that it ends up being suppressed because of like over investment in like the more ambitious or driven side of us. Yeah, I think actually, like I was looking in the chat, Phil brought up a really good point about how there's this like danger of like, if you try out like a new hobby and you become pretty good at it, then there's like this pressure, like either from other, maybe external or internal pressure to like to capitalize on it, which I think is a very, yeah, relatable struggle for people. And I think that's like, I guess like speaking personally, part of the reason why I don't want my job to involve writing. And like, because I've decided writing is this thing that I really enjoy and it's like, I consider it a vocation, then if I had to do it to make money, I think I would just, yeah, not enjoy it as much. And I'm sure other people have felt similarly about writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, this is making me think about how we often tie up what we do to like a fixed identity. And I think kind of touching on what Katrina was mentioning about the internal family system stuff, I always just kind of play around with this idea of like, what if like identity was not so fixed of a thing, and like what if it was more dynamic and more like contextual? Because I think like the centrality of like work to our lives is because it like says something about our identity. But what if that was just a more fluid, like loose thing that changes and touches on like you know, just different parts of ourselves. And you know, that's just something I'm playing with now as I'm like pursuing a bunch of other creative stuff. And like it can be like kind of a scary thing because you don't have this like fixed like, this is me, this is what I do. But at the same time, like fun stuff can kind of emerge from that. Like when I just am playing music, for example, there's this like side of me that's way more alive and alert and like just more, I don't know, it's like the side of me that I don't really see very often, like in very many other contexts. So it's like, ooh, this is kind of exciting. And like I think it gives me something to like look forward to in terms of like meaning making, like outside of work.
Yeah, and I'm curious, actually, like Phil or anyone who has like something that you're passionate about outside of work, how do you ever show that side of you at work? Because this is something I think about a lot. Like the person I am at work is like different from the person I am in other aspects with other people in my life and other domains of my life. And I think what's challenging is people say like you should bring your full self to work, or you know, but it's really not that easy. And a part of it is because of the structure of work where you're expected to like almost like treat work as your main priority. Like it's like like how dare you have a life outside work? I mean, not like that, but it's sort of it's almost like we are expected to show up to work as like, this is all I care about, and this is like the, yeah, I'm 100% dedicated to this. So it's almost like if you show other things that you're passionate about, there might be this idea that you aren't as devoted as you should be, which is obviously not correct, but yeah, I was curious if other people think about that and how you deal with it, I guess.
Go ahead, Billy.
Oh, you can go.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, one image I think that was coming up for me just throughout the discussion. But I think also like a lot from like Phil, what you were describing, and like also like your earlier points on like the career ladder and like the expectation that you kind of like continue growing in that way, was like this image of like, you know, work is this sort of like component of your life, or this like kind of area in your life that you can explore. And like what's nice about it is it's like, you know, fairly well defined in terms of like the constraints that exist, and like, you know, it provides you money and like can provide you some sort of fulfillment. And there's like, you know, this like somewhat defined like, hey, here's the career ladder of like what we recommend you kind of grow down. And then I think it's like easy for us because it's like, you know, well defined, or like, you know, somewhat well defined, and like you kind of have to work, right, to like pay your bills. It's easy for us to like, I think, focus on that as like, okay, this path is like mostly set, you can just like continue to walk down the path, versus I think the kind of like other areas of your life are like more nebulous. And it's like, you know, you kind of like, you can pursue the stuff that's interesting to you, but like how you do that really depends on like your own individual preferences and interests and things like that. And so it's just like a lot harder of an area to explore. So yeah, that was like sort of one, like the image that I had in mind. I like forgot how this connected to what Elaine, you were asking, but yeah. Oh yeah, I think it's just, yeah, with like with work and it being like well defined, it has like, yeah, expectations of like how you are to behave if you want to like walk down that path or like enter that domain. And then I think there's also like the idea of like, you know, if everyone's more uniform, then it's like easier for like, you know, a corporation to like function, right? If you're just like, everyone is just like a drone, and doesn't have like divergent personality and like is trying to be autonomous, then you can kind of just like do the job you're told to do, and then the company is happy, that kind of thing. So yeah, just some scattered thoughts there.
I dig it. I mean, I think like one of the arguments I make about how we got to this point was the erosion of infrastructure for other sources of meaning and identity in our lives. So with the breakdown of things like organized religion or neighborhood and community groups, work has come to fill that void for so many people that are still looking for belonging and identity and meaning and purpose. And I think, you know, the other side of that is what you just brought up, Billy, which is that like, it's much easier to define yourself based on work because it's so legible. You know, people can relate to it. It's easy to find common ground. It's a conversation starter at a cocktail party. And if, you know, Elaine had asked us to introduce ourselves and everyone was like, I am an amateur kite builder, you know, like people wouldn't know what to do with that. And I think part of it comes back to infrastructure on the other end too. It's like, unless we have a culture where we are championing and valuing things outside of work, it's going to be harder for people to define themselves outside of work. Unless we have a culture that makes it easier for people to build communities that reinforce identities beyond what you do for work, it's going to be harder for people to be able to introduce themselves or define themselves based on things outside of work. You know, like for me personally, I love to play pickup basketball. I think one of the values of playing pickup is that no one that I play basketball with gives a fuck about what I do for work. You know, like they don't care how many books I've sold or words I've written that week. You know, what they care about is that like, I don't know, I show up on time and I like box out when I rebound. You know, it's like a different value system. And I think that work provides a container for one value system, and it's an important one, you know, especially if you think about how much time we give to work. And there are certain metrics that matter in that value system, and you're judged based on the KPIs of the organization or what have you. But it's important to recognize that that's just one container. And part of like the work of the book is hoping to urge people to find other containers where different sides of themselves are reinforced, where different values are championed.
It's just
go ahead.
This discussion just reminds me of like the like very like funny and strange and like profound experience that I have every year on Ash Wednesday, when like I go to church in the morning and like, you know, have my forehead like marked with a like ash cross, and then for the whole rest of the day, like at work and like studying, people are like, oh, you've got like a smudge on your forehead, like do you want me to like wipe it off? And then you sort of, and I sort of have to explain that like, oh, like this, you know, this cross is like, you know, it's made of ash, and like it's reminding me that, you know, I'm like flawed and like I've got lots of problems with me, but it's also to remind us about death and our own mortality. And it like is a very like strange but also a very like profound experience, because, you know, people see this like Zoom window of you at work, and you're normally like in the meetings working on the thing, but it's like a window into another like deeper conversation. And yeah, I like also bristle at the like you know, you have to bring your like whole self for work, but it is also it also can be like kind of beautiful when those different identities and parts of your life start to intersect, and you create those spaces for more like humanness, I guess.
I just wanted to echo a little bit what Simone and Billy were talking about. And sometimes it's hard to remember that it is a capitalistic relationship. And it really does benefit the corporate world that certain identities are preferred. And I think we've seen that strongly since probably World War II. I have these conversations with fellow employees every week as part of my job. So I'm really privileged in that way. But I've really seen that COVID has blown this all open for people, because it has allowed them this space to think anew about these relationships and who they want to be. And a lot of it does come down to agency. And I was so glad when Katrina talked about how privileged this conversation is. We do a lot of work with people who are in refugee camps throughout the Middle East, and they would do anything to have a job because of the agency it would afford them in life for themselves and for their family. So I can't wait to read your book, Simone, because in particular, I'm interested in how this is a capitalistic, but also an American phenomenon, that we have lost these relationships to meaning and to community across our society. And somehow the American individualism is all bound up with capitalism, and those seem to be parallel developments in our society. So I am eager to read the book, but I'm glad that this notion about what benefits the companies we work for has come out. You know, Google used to be the greatest place to work. It has always been held up as a fun place, a place that cared about their teams, a place that really treated their employees well. And when we look at their layoffs this year, even some small percentage of Googlers have killed themselves after being laid off because their identity was so tied up in being a Google employee. So, you know, these notions of identity, I think, are really important. And Naomi brought up, you know, bringing about your whole self. And I think the workplace is getting much more interesting as time goes by, but it's difficult really to bring your whole self anywhere, much less alone to work.
And if I can add something to what Elaine said, Elaine, you asked if we're comfortable bringing our identity to work and how do we feel about it. Remember that we also not supposed to bring our emotions as well at work. So if something happens in our life, personal life, a breakup or grief or joy, even, like, we need to remain professional. We are not supposed to cry at work or experience a lot of joy because other people might be envious. And that creates kind of a weird feeling because you know in your personal life you have these things happening and you need to forget them during 8 hours of your work time. And the COVID, I think, helped that because now more and more companies are creating mental health days or emergency days. So if something happened, you can take a day off and process. But yeah, I think the disconnection between your personal emotion and work is really not a bad place to be. And I'm happy, as Faye say, that there is more and more now room for that. And as Naomi shared, she can sometimes share about her religion or about mortality or death, while it was supposed to be taboo topics before. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about emotions.
Yeah, that's a really great point about emotions. And it actually reminded me of something that one of my former bosses used to do. Like every time we had a team meeting, she would start by asking every person to using like red, yellow, green to identify like how they were feeling, like their emotional state. And just to recognize that, you know, we could all be in different emotional states depending on what else is going on in our lives. And so I found that really helpful because it's sort of like you don't even have to like go into it. You just kind of, it's like just a good way to recognize like where people are. Yeah. One thing actually in the book that I was very curious about, and I know we're almost at time. So if you guys have any final questions or thoughts, definitely you know, feel free to put it in the chat. There's this experiment about like on motivation with preschoolers where I think they were divided into 3 groups, and one group was shown like a reward for drawing, or I think it was they were told that if they drew for like an hour or something, they would be given this reward, and they were shown what the reward was. And then the second group was not told about the reward, but they were given it afterwards. And then the third group wasn't given anything. And they found that I think like, I don't know what it was, like 10 years later or something, the 2 groups that weren't told that they were going to receive a reward were like drawing just as much as they used to, whereas like the first group, they were like drawing less, which I think is funny because it just shows how we could be trained to expect certain rewards for certain actions, and it kind of like we end up losing any like intrinsic motivation. Yeah, that I thought was a great example in your book, Simone. Yeah, I guess I'm curious, I know you interviewed so many people and only a few of their stories could make it into the book, but was there anything like out of all the conversations you had, like maybe one that didn't make it into the book that you'd love to share with us?
Yeah, what was left on the cutting room floor? There were a few. I had a chapter about this guy who was a survivor of the Columbine shooting. For those outside of the US, it was this big high school shooting that happened in the early 2000s, right at the turn of the century. And he became a motivational speaker. And so for the past 20 years, he traveled around the world advocating for gun reform and talking about the danger of violence in schools. And now he's in his 40s and he wants a more boring job. And he's studying to become an accountant, a tax accountant. And that is a really interesting story because it was about sort of like impact and what is the line between giving yourself to a cause versus losing yourself in that cause. And ultimately, and we decided to cut that chapter, but I think like it's an interesting question, especially for people like, Faye and Naomi, who have worked in some nonprofit or do-gooder industries where, you know, there's a huge benefit from being able to attach your work to something that's larger than yourself, to be able to think about what is this type of contribution or impact that you're hoping to make. But if it comes at the expense of your ability to take care of yourself or to fill up your own cup, as it were, then where do we draw that line? So that was like an example of a story that didn't make it in. And as you might imagine, I've had so many people reach out to me since the book has come out that want to share their own stories. I feel like even the people on this call, everyone has a really interesting career trajectory and anecdotes that would be relevant and interesting to other folks. So I'm at a sort of interesting place now where it's, I'm thinking about my next book and whether I want to stay in sort of the work realm and continue to explore this topic or swerve and do something else. So that's the sort of meditation of my heart of the moment.
That's really awesome. Yeah, I think this like pretty much wraps up our salon. Let's take a group picture if people feel comfortable with that. You can, if you don't, you can opt out. Totally fine. I will count to 3. 1 second. Let me just get this ready. Great. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay, we got it. Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming to the salon and sharing your stories and perspectives and really engaging on this topic. And Simone, thank you so much for joining us. This was really wonderful. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks you so much for having me and for taking time out of your weekend to be here, and Elaine for coordinating and organizing all of this. And if you guys want to stay in touch, there's sort of 2 ways to do so. One is I have a book club, which is not actually a book club. It's an article book club where twice a month I send out one sort of interesting article from the internet that a group of people read together. So you can join that at articlebookclub.substack.com. And also you can read the book. My email and all that stuff is available online. The website is thegoodenoughjob.com. And thank you so much for being here. It's such a joy to be able to meet curious folks, and especially coming out of the pandemic, this sort of intellect feels sort of like a vestige of 2020 in some ways. We're at our Zoom happy hour, but it's a good reminder of the joy of just connecting with people who are curious and want to make time for conversations about the bigger things.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Take it easy.
Bye. Thank you.